Welcome to Stoned Stories with me, Paige. How are you? Whether you need an escape or just a moment to unwind, you're in the right place. Everyone loves a story, and everyone needs a break. So sit back and let me take you on a gemological journey. And while we're at it, let's get stoned. What if I told you that one little red crystal managed to convince almost every civilization on Earth that it held supernatural powers? Some people believed it was dragon's blood. Others thought it was the blood of Earth itself. Ancient kings offered them to gods in exchange for power. Warriors cut open their own skin and buried rubies beneath their flesh because they believed it made them impossible to kill. During the Black Plague, people carried them hoping they'd keep disease away. Some believed they glowed brighter when danger approached or darkened before their owner died. And maybe the craziest part is that these stories came from cultures separated by thousands of miles, who had never met each other, completely different civilizations, completely different religions, completely different languages. Yet somehow they all looked at the same red stone and saw something sacred. Today, we're following one gemstone across thousands of years of human history, from the temples of India to the jungles of Burma, through dragons, serpents, warriors, emperors, and myths that somehow refuse to die. Because this is the story of the King of Gems. Hey everybody, welcome back to Stoned Stories, and whether you're stoned and convinced your houseplant is judging you, or you're completely sober and just need a break from reality, I'm really glad you're here, because today we're talking about one of the most famous gemstones on Earth, the ruby. Now, I know everyone knows what a ruby is. It's the classic red gemstone. It's July's birthstone. It's in fairy tales, it's in crowns, it's in engagement rings. The Wizard of Oz made ruby slippers famous. It's basically the gemstone equivalent of someone who's been famous for so long that nobody remembers why they're even famous anymore. And that's kind of what happened with rubies. Most people know what they look like, but very few people know why humans have been completely obsessed with them for literally thousands of years. And for me, I couldn't stop wondering while researching this episode, how did civilizations separated by oceans who never met each other all end up believing the same little red stone possessed supernatural power? So today, we're diving in deep to all of it. But before we jump into dragons and warriors shoving gemstones in their own bodies, which yes, actually happened, I think we need to answer one simple question. Why this stone? Out of every gemstone on Earth, why did ruby become the gemstone? Why not emerald or sapphire or diamonds? Because believe it or not, there was a very long time when diamonds weren't considered the most valuable gemstone. For much of human history, that title belonged to ruby. In ancient India, it was literally called the King of Gems. Not one of the kings, the king. And honestly, I don't think it's a coincidence, because humans are really weird about the color red. Think about it. Fire, blood, sunsets, danger, love, anger, passion, life, and death. Our brains are wired to notice red before almost anything else. If you saw someone walking towards you covered in red, your brain immediately pays attention. Maybe they're injured. Maybe they're wearing an amazing outfit. Maybe they're just really committed to Valentine's Day. Either way, you're looking. Red demands attention. And for ancient humans, blood meant life itself. Lose enough of it and you're gone. So imagine finding a rock that naturally looked like frozen blood. Not brown, not rusty, and not dull. Bright, rich, deep red. A stone that never dried out, never faded, never rotted away. It looked alive. And I think that's where everything begins. Because before people understood chemistry, before geology and microscopes, they explained extraordinary things with extraordinary stories. If a gemstone looked alive, well, maybe it was. Now today, we know exactly what a ruby is. Well, mostly. Geology still likes to humble us every once in a while, but here's the simplified version. A ruby starts as the mineral corundum. Sapphires and rubies, they're actually siblings. They're the exact same mineral. Same chemical formation, same formula, the same crystal structure. The only real difference is one tiny ingredient, chromium. That's it. Just tiny traces of chromium replacing some of the aluminum atoms inside the crystal. It's honestly kind of ridiculous. The difference between a blue sapphire and one of the most valuable gemstones on Earth comes down to a few atoms deciding they wanted to sit somewhere else. Nature is very dramatic like that. But getting those atoms together, that's where things get difficult. Rubies don't form just anywhere. They spend millions of years buried around 18 to 30 miles beneath Earth's surface. That's where we're talking. Temperatures reach hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 degrees. Pressure becomes almost impossible to imagine, and entire mountains are forming. Continents are colliding, rocks are literally changing into different rocks. Somewhere inside all of that chaos, tiny ruby crystals begin to grow. Not in weeks or centuries, millions and millions of years, which I also think is incredible. Because while we're over here complaining that Amazon says our package will arrive on Thursday instead of Tuesday, nature's just like, yeah, I'll get back to you in 8 million years. No rush. Eventually, these rocks are pushed back toward the surface. Mountains rise, rivers carve valleys, erosion strips away layer after layer, until one day, someone notices a flash of red. And just like that, a legend begins. Now here's something I absolutely love about rubies. Remember all those stories we started with? The glowing, the magical power, the idea that the stone looked alive? Well, there's something about rubies that still kind of feels magical today. Rubies fluoresce, which basically means under ultraviolet light, they don't just reflect light, they actually give off their own. Some rubies fluoresce so strongly that even under normal sunlight, they seem to glow from within. If you've ever seen a really exceptional Burmese ruby, it's almost difficult to explain. It doesn't just sparkle. It looks illuminated, like someone hid a tiny ember inside the crystal. Now, scientists can explain exactly why that happens. The chromium atoms absorb energy, then release it as a visible red light. Sounds simple, makes perfect sense. But imagine seeing that 3,000 years ago. No chemistry, no physics, just a gemstone that appeared to have fire trapped inside it. I'd probably think it was magical too. And maybe that's why every civilization came up with their own explanation. Not because people were foolish, but because they were trying to explain something genuinely extraordinary with the tools that they had. Some said dragon blood, some said divine gifts. Others believed rubies were the very blood of Mother Earth, crystallized over millions of years beneath the mountains. Different stories, same feeling, wonder. And as we'll find out, no place inspired more wonder than a hidden valley deep inside the mountains of Burma. Because according to one ancient legend, before there were kingdoms, before there were mines, long before there were maps, before mining companies, before geologists could explain how rubies formed, there was this story. According to the legend, at the beginning of time, a giant serpent named Naga laid 3 eggs. The first egg hatches, and from it came the king of Pagan. The second egg became the emperor of China. But it was the third egg that was unlike anything anyone expected. From that final egg came every ruby on Earth. Imagine believing that. Not that rubies grew underground or formed inside rocks, but that every single one was descended from the egg of a mythical serpent. Suddenly, holding a ruby wasn't just owning a beautiful stone. You were holding something born before civilization itself, something ancient, sacred, and maybe something still carrying a little bit of that serpent's power. Now, whether the legend came first, or whether it grew because of the place where rubies were found, it's hard to say, because the real location where these stones came from already sounded like mythology. Hidden deep within the mountains of what is now Myanmar lies a region called Magok. If you've spent any time in the gem world, you've probably heard that name whispered with almost mythical reverence. Magok isn't just another mining district. It's the ruby mining district. For more than 2,000 years, people have traveled there searching for what many still consider the finest rubies ever discovered. To a gem nerd, Magok is basically the Louvre, the Smithsonian, the Disneyland, and it's all rolled into one. Except instead of Mickey Mouse, it's millions of years of geology. Now, ancient travelers described Magok almost like it existed outside the normal world. Dense jungle, steep mountains, hidden valleys, mist hanging over the trees. It was isolated enough that simply reaching it felt like completing a quest, which, naturally, led to another incredible legend. People believed Magok was actually the Valley of the Serpents, a place where enormous, precious stones lay scattered across the floor of a deep ravine, guarded by deadly snakes. Apparently, the ancient solution wasn't, maybe we shouldn't go in there. No! Instead, they came up with one of the most creative gemstone retrieval systems I've ever heard. They threw giant chunks of meat into the ravine. Seriously. The meat would land among the gemstones, and rubies would stick to the bloody flesh. Then, vultures would swoop down, grab the meat, fly back out of the valley, and after the birds finished eating, people would recover the gemstones from the vultures. Now, I don't know who the first person was to look at a vulture and think, you know what? I bet that guy can help me mine gemstones. But I appreciate the creativity. And once again, even if none of that actually happened, I love what the story tells us. Rubies weren't seen as something humans simply dug out of the ground. They had to be earned. Nature protected them. The earth hid them. Only the clever, or maybe the lucky, were worthy enough to find them. That's a theme you'll notice over and over again with rubies. They're never just rocks. They're prizes, almost like the earth didn't really want to let them go. And when you learn how incredibly rare fine rubies actually are, it feels true. You can mine thousands upon thousands of tons of rock and never find a ruby worth cutting. Finding one with exceptional color, good clarity, and enough size to become a world-famous gemstone, that's like winning the geological lottery. Maybe that's why people invented myths instead of probabilities. It was easier to imagine dragons guarding treasure than to understand just how absurdly unlikely it was to find one. But while Burma gave the ruby its legendary birthplace, there was another civilization that elevated it to something even greater. Not just a treasure, not just a magical stone, but the most important gemstone in existence. That civilization was India. Ancient India loved gemstones. They loved gemstones. They were elaborate systems for classifying them, sacred texts describing their spiritual powers. Kings collected them, priests blessed them, merchants crossed continents trading them. Gemstones weren't luxury items. They were woven directly into religion, medicine, politics, and philosophy. Among all of them, one stood above every other stone, the ruby. It earns the title, Ratnaraj, which translates to the King of Gems. Not because it was the biggest or the rarest, but because it represented life itself. Strength, power, vitality, royal authority. Everything a ruler hoped to embody. Ancient Indian texts even describe a mythical wish-fulfilling tree called the Kalpa tree. Imagine the most magnificent tree you've ever seen, whatever that means to you. Now replace the leaves with emeralds. Its branches shimmer with sapphires. Diamonds catch the sunlight like dew. Topaz glows among the limbs. The entire tree is made from precious stones. Beautiful enough already. But hanging from its branches like ripe fruit are rubies, the greatest treasure, growing at the very top. I love that image. Because out of every gemstone they could have imagined, they chose rubies as the final reward, the crown jewel, the fruit everyone wanted. And rubies weren't just admired, they were offered directly to the gods. Ancient Hindu traditions taught that presenting a ruby to Krishna was among the highest offering a person could make. One sacred text even claimed that whoever worshipped Krishna with a ruby would one day be reborn as a powerful emperor. And if the ruby was small, well, then maybe you'd only come back as a king, which is also the most gemstone thing I've ever heard. Like, sorry, that one's just a 1-carat ruby. Best I can do is royalty. But beneath the humor, there's something really profound happening. People weren't sacrificing rubies because they expected gemstones to perform magic. They offered them because they represented the very best humanity had to give. The rarest, the most beautiful, the hardest to obtain. A ruby became a physical expression of devotion, a way of saying, nothing I own is more precious than this. And I think that's beautiful, because regardless of what religion you follow or don't follow, every culture has something they reserve for life's biggest moments. The finest wine, the family heirloom, the wedding ring, the special china your parents somehow never let anyone actually use. For ancient India, that symbol was the ruby. But the ruby's journey through spirituality didn't stop there. As Buddhism spread across Asia, rubies took an entirely new meaning, one that had nothing to do with kings and everything to do with enlightenment. Because according to Buddhist tradition, there are 7 treasures, and among the most sacred of them all is the ruby. By now, we've traveled from ancient India to the mountains of Burma. We've met giant serpents, wish-fulfilling trees, and kingdoms built around one little red crystal. But something kept catching my attention while I was researching this episode. No matter where I looked, people weren't just collecting rubies, they were trusting them. And I don't mean trusting them to hold their value or trusting they were real gemstones. I mean, they trusted rubies with their lives. Because for thousands of years, people believed a ruby wasn't just beautiful, it was alive. Now, that might sound a little ridiculous today, but think about it. If you lived 2,000 years ago and someone handed you a gemstone that looked like fresh blood and it never dried out, it never faded, sometimes even seemed to glow from inside, wouldn't you wonder if there was something more to it? Apparently, a lot of people did. As Buddhism spread throughout Asia, rubies became one of the 7 treasures. They weren't simply expensive objects, they represented spiritual wealth. Wisdom, compassion, enlightenment. The ruby wasn't valuable because it was rare, it was valuable because it symbolized the light someone could carry within themselves. And I love that interpretation, because unlike a crown or a palace or a pile of gold, a ruby could fit in the palm of your hand. A tiny reminder that strength isn't always measured by size. But nowhere did people believe in the ruby's power more than in Burma. Now, remember, Burma wasn't just home to incredible rubies. It was home to the people who mined them, who lived among them, who built stories around them for generations, and eventually, those stories made their way into the battlefield. Ancient Burmese warriors believed rubies granted invincibility. Not courage or luck, invincibility. At first, soldiers simply wore them, around their necks or in rings, sometimes sewn into their clothing. But eventually, someone had a much more committed idea. What if wearing the ruby just wasn't enough? Because according to tradition, the ruby had to become part of you. Historical accounts describe warriors making small cuts in their skin, placing a ruby beneath the flesh, and allowing the wound to heal over it. They believed that once the gemstone became part of their body, they could no longer be pierced by spears or swords. Some accounts even claimed bullets now. Obviously, we know that's not how physics works, but also I don't think that's the most fascinating part of the story. The fascinating part is what someone has to believe to willingly cut themselves open for a gemstone. That's not fashion, that's faith. Whether the protection was real didn't matter nearly as much as the courage it inspired. Because imagine charging into battle, truly believing that you could not be killed. That's a terrifying amount of confidence. And confidence has won plenty of battles throughout history. Rubies weren't only associated with protection from enemies. People believed they could heal the body too. Ancient healers connected the ruby's deep red color with blood itself. If blood was life, then surely a stone that looks like blood must somehow contain life as well. Historical writings describe the ruby being used to treat bleeding, reduce inflammation, and restore strength after illness. In medieval Europe, the famous physician and alchemist Paracelsus even experimented with powdered ruby in his medical treatments. Medicine looked a little different back then, okay? A lot different. If your doctor today prescribed powdered gemstones, you should probably find another doctor. But at that time, this was not considered strange. People believed gemstones possessed natural energies, just waiting to be unlocked. Even plague victims sometimes wore ruby rings or brooches, hoping the gemstone would shield them from disease. And when medicine is limited, hope becomes its own kind of treatment. Then there was another belief, one that I also absolutely love. People thought rubies could warn you before disaster struck. Ancient Greeks, Romans, and later medieval Europeans believed a ruby could change. Some said it darkened, others claimed it lost its brilliance. Either way, if your ruby suddenly looked different, something bad was coming. Imagine checking your ring every morning, not because you're admiring the stone, because you're wondering if today is the day it tries to save your life. I don't know about you, but I think my anxiety would somehow become even worse. Like, wait, was it always that color? Is it shining differently today? Does it mean I shouldn't leave the house, or am I just looking at it under different lighting? I'd be stressing. People also believed rubies protected against nightmares, evil spirits, and jealousy. Some traditions suggested placing one beneath your pillow to keep bad dreams away. Others believed wearing one close to your heart could attract good fortune, while pushing away anyone who wished you harm. And it's funny because even today, people still assign emotional meaning to gemstones. Confidence, love, grounding, protection. Maybe we've changed the language, but the instinct hasn't really disappeared. We've always wanted beautiful things to help us feel safer. Then, on the other side of Asia, another civilization looked at rubies and saw something completely different. Dragons. In ancient China, dragons weren't villains. They weren't monsters guarding treasure. They represented wisdom, strength, prosperity, and divine protection. Naturally, a gemstone as extraordinary as a ruby had to be connected to them. Some legends claimed rubies were crystallized dragon blood. Others believed dragons carried rubies beneath their scales. Owning one meant carrying a fragment of the dragon's strength. Rubies were placed beneath the foundations of buildings to invite prosperity. They protected homes from evil spirits. They represented vitality, good fortune, and success. Again, a completely different culture, a completely different religion, yet somehow the ruby still represented life, strength, protection. And that is what amazes me. Nobody sent out a memo. There wasn't some ancient gemstone committee meeting once a year to decide, okay, everybody, rubies now mean courage. These beliefs developed independently, across continents. It's almost like the gemstone itself guided people toward the same ideas. Not because it actually held magic, but because humans everywhere share the same fears. We fear death, we fear illness, we fear losing the people we love. So naturally, when we discovered something that looked immortal, something that looked like frozen life itself, we gave it the power we wished we had. Because the stories were never really about the ruby. They were about us, as they usually are. About what we hope for, what we fear, and what we're willing to believe when we stumble across something extraordinary. But if there's one thing humans love almost as much as giving meaning to gemstones, it's giving them names. And no ruby has earned a more legendary name than one known simply as pigeon's blood. So, after thousands of years of myths, there's still one ruby that sits above all the others. One color, description, name that every gem collector dreams of hearing. Pigeon's blood. Now, if you've ever heard that phrase before, I know it's a little intense. Gemologists really weren't workshopping friendlier names back then. But despite sounding like the title of an incredibly aggressive heavy metal album, pigeon's blood has become the gold standard for ruby color. It describes the finest rubies in the world, not just because they're red, because they're a very specific red, deep, rich, almost glowing, with just the slightest hint of blue beneath the surface that gives the stone a soft, velvety appearance. It's the kind of color that almost doesn't look real, the kind of ruby you can't stop staring at. Most of the world's legendary pigeon's blood rubies came from one place, Magog, that valley we've been talking about since the beginning, and fittingly, even the name's pigeon blood has its own legends. One story says it came from the first drops of blood spilled from a pigeon, believed to possess the purest red imaginable. Another claim, it refers to the vivid red ring around a pigeon's eye. Nobody knows for certain. But honestly, I kind of like that. Some mysteries deserve to stay mysteries. Because once you explain everything, sometimes the magic disappears. Now, what makes these rubies so valuable isn't just their beauty, it's their rarity. You can mine for years, possess thousands upon thousands of tons of rock, and never uncover a ruby worthy of that name. Nature almost never gets everything right. Maybe the color is perfect, but there are too many inclusions. Maybe it's clean, but too pink. Maybe it's large, but too dark. Finding a ruby with exceptional color, excellent clarity, good size, natural origin, it's incredibly rare. That's why some natural rubies sell for more per carat than diamonds. Yep, the gemstone everyone assumes is the most valuable, it just isn't. And in fact, some of the finest rubies have shattered auction records. Collectors compete for them. Museums proudly display them. Royal families have treasured them for centuries. Which reminds me, there's something kind of funny about royal collections. For hundreds of years, European kings and queens absolutely loved decorating their crowns with what they thought were enormous rubies. Turns out, quite a few of them weren't rubies at all. They were spinels. For centuries, people couldn't tell the difference. Some of history's most famous rubies later turned out to be completely different gemstones, which makes me feel a little bit better about the times I've confidently identified a rock only to realize 5 minutes later, nope, that's definitely not what I thought it was. Gemology keeps us humble. Even kings got fooled. One of my favorite examples is the Black Prince's ruby. Now, despite the name, it's actually one of the world's most famous red spinels. It has sat in the British imperial state crown for centuries. Kings went to battle wearing it. Generations believed it was one of history's greatest rubies. And turns out, nature had one more surprise waiting. I love it. Because it reminds us the stories are often more important than the labels. Then there are star rubies. And this one blows my mind. If you've ever seen one, they're unbelievable. Instead of sparkling like a faceted gemstone, a polished star ruby displays a bright, six-rayed star that seems to float across its surface as the light moves. No batteries, no special effects, just tiny needle-like crystals trapped inside the ruby millions of years ago. To ancient people, that probably looked like a whole other miracle. To gemologists, it's called asterism. Personally, I think both explanations are pretty cool. One of the most famous examples is the Star of Burma, a ruby so extraordinary that even among legendary gemstones, it stands apart. And then there's something that completely changed the gem world. In 1908, scientists figured out how to grow rubies in a laboratory. And for the first time in history, people could create gemstones that looked almost identical to natural rubies. The invention sent shockwaves through the jewelry world. Buyers panicked, merchants worried. Some feared natural rubies would lose all of their value overnight. Sound familiar? Every generation thinks technology is about to replace something irreplaceable. Photography was supposed to kill painting. Streaming was supposed to kill movie theaters. Artificial intelligence is supposedly replacing, well, everything these days. And yet, natural rubies are still among the most valuable gemstones on Earth. Because while humans can recreate the chemistry, we can't recreate the journey. A laboratory can make a ruby in months. Nature takes millions of years. One forms inside carefully controlled machines, and the other inside colliding continents. somewhere beneath mountains, hidden in darkness, waiting patiently for someone to find it. And I think that's part of what we're really buying. Not just a gemstone, a story. Because that's what every ruby really is, a story. A story about continents crashing together, a story about chromium atoms finding exactly the right place, a story about miners searching dangerous mountains, a story about kings, dragons, serpents, warriors, and dreamers. For thousands of years, humanity kept looking at the same little red crystal and seeing something different. The Burmese saw courage, the Indians saw divine power, the Chinese saw dragons, the Greeks saw passion, the Europeans saw protection, Buddhists saw enlightenment, scientists see aluminum oxide with tiny traces of chromium. And here's the funny thing. None of those answers cancel the others out. Science tells us how a ruby forms, and stories tell us why it mattered. Those are two completely different questions. One doesn't erase the other. If anything, they make each other even more fascinating. Because knowing that a ruby formed 20 miles beneath Earth's surface over millions of years doesn't make the myths less beautiful. It makes them easier to understand. Humans have always tried to explain extraordinary things, and sometimes we use chemistry and sometimes we use dragons. I think there's room for both. Maybe that's why after thousands of years we're still captivated by rubies. Not because we believe they'll make us invincible anymore, or warn us about danger, or guarantee we'll be reborn as emperors, but because every time we look into one, we're seeing the exact same thing that our ancestors saw. A tiny piece of the earth that somehow looks alive. And maybe that's magical enough. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me for another episode. If you've enjoyed today's journey through history, mythology, and science behind the King of Gems, I'd really appreciate if you'd follow the show and leave a review. It genuinely helps more people stumble across these weird little gemstone rabbit holes with us. And if you know someone who loves history, mythology, or just really shiny things, send this episode their way. Well, that concludes today's stone story. I hope you tune in next week, because as always, next episode is sure to be a gem.